Hello. I would like to speak to you today about what is interpretation. Why is it misunderstood? With the thresholds of improvisation, transcription, possibly paraphrase? Is it possible that parts of all these ways of revisiting the texture, perhaps the narration, or even more specifically, the meaning of a music through the written text, which we receive it from the dead composers of the past, is a translation. So what do we translate? The intents, the affects, or the meaning rather than only the aesthetic beauty of it? Though the aesthetic beauty of it is part of music. Music is a language, music is a state of being. Music is, in fact, a psychological way of apprehending every other art form as well as nature. And it comes out from a composer who filtered at some point of their life what they received genetically or through acquired situations, and then they crystallize it just like writers do with words, painters with images, sculptors in 3 dimensions or more. And I find that music influences psychologically beyond words. It's more powerful than a mime or a dancer by the gesture of the suggested hint that it creates in your subconscious or psyche as a listener, because it manipulates your emotions in subtle ways. It brings you to appreciate the meaning of what is an expectation or a disappointment or excitement with sadness, and nothing fully and everything partially. And it's this layered, nuanced way of expressing the music that impresses most of us, because, in a way, every time it's read by a different musician or rendered by a different musician who plays it through their own understanding, why do we matter even to worry about if it's authentic or not? According to whom? Is it the publisher who owns the authenticity of the composer's intent? No. It is a codification of some signs that, put together, would recreate the music of the expression that was in the composer's emotion and thought process. But how do we define it to the point to which we lock it from being different by somebody else? Like, is there a fluctuation of tempo within a structure? Is it because a different thematic material brings in a different mood that we need to unify it because it's the structure that prevails over the expression of the moods? Or is it that we just zigzag through the moods and express everything at every level, be it the micro level where every affect, a suspension, an acciatura, appoggiatura, trill, an emotional delay of a note, it becomes there at the level of the syllable, possibly even of the phoneme. And then we talk about beauty or aesthetics because of the fact that, despite of the meaning, music has its own beauty as a language. It's like when you listen to a foreign language you don't speak, you hear the sounds without the meaning, and you're either bewildered, either impressed, surprised, whatever you are, you don't know what it is. But you try to guess if there is a rapport between what you perceive in the sound shapes of the words pronounced, or the sounds made through the throat with the vowels and the consonants and different tone levels, or is it a high-pitched, lower-pitched note that you hear? You almost can take in dictation a foreign language musically without the meaning. And then once you know the meaning that the language is vehicling, which is the point of the language, to connect and to transmit and to perhaps even contradict, but for sure to express thoughts that cannot be only guessed by the face or the look. I find that at that point, the meaning prevails over the beauty of the language itself. So you can say, I love you in many languages, Sarapo in Greek, Je t'aime in French, Ich liebe dich in German, and so forth and so on, within their context. But by themselves, they sound whatever they are, diphthongs and resonances of the tongue and the throat and the resonators. In other words, we produce these sounds. But as I'm talking to you, I'm trying to convey a message, a meaning, a thought, an experience, possibly a sum of what made me understand what is the purpose of interpretation in music. It's very noble. I don't think it's detained and should be detained by musicologists, music critics, reviewers, possibly only scholars who would have the stamped authorization to be authority on what is the truth. It is their truth. There is no right. It's only what you make it. When you love, it's the way you love. And even if generations before you loved, for which we exist on earth, obviously they loved differently, but they loved. They hated differently, but they hated. They admired differently and different things, but they did. And so on and so forth. So the basics of life, which is explore life, imagine what is that we come out of the experience of it. You know, if I was younger, I would not redo the same mistakes. How many people say that, right? So an older teacher transmits an interpretation by telling the student, I'll help you go through the hurdles so you don't have to go through yourself for what I went already. But in a way, the initiating of this is to be able to start oneself, one's own exploration of these eternal restartings of human nature. I mean, we all love, to be loved, to seduce, to be liked, to be helpful. We try to be compassionate. All these things are there. But the words and the language also expresses thoughts and science and global views and contradictory things where morality is to do not only with religion but also with what is the sense of the greater good. And sometimes it's contradictory with the personal good. So we enter in philosophical situations where we think more than just ourselves and our experience of life. We try to understand how people thought of life in Sumerian times and in Egyptian life, what they worshipped, how they treated death, what they were fearing in the sense of the finitude, how they were dealing with it, why and how they were interacting and therefore fighting and therefore greed and competition and descendants and jealousy. There will be no opera representing life as it is, what it was when it was created. The opera means work in Italian. It's theater and singing and acting and reflecting on life's situations, death, betrayal, love, adultery, hope. In other words, all these elements are eternal in all our societies, in fact, whichever their way of expression of it is, their dance or tribal ways or intellectual essays. And people can be saying, it's too much to know, too much to be curious, I don't understand most of it. So we need the translation to read Sumerian, we need translation to read Latin, we need translation to read, I don't know, Finnish. In other words, do we read Cervantes in Spanish and Shakespeare in English and Molière in French and Heidegger in German? Ideally, yes, but we can't. So we have to go through a translation. So does Mozart, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Fauré, Debussy, Tchaikovsky, Monteverdi, Couperin, do they all need a translator if music is supposed to be the international language that doesn't need translation? I don't think so. I think they're embedded in their culture, they're embedded in their time period. They're in their own, in fact, beautiful and meaningful time capsule. And they are universal, not because they can be played on any other instrument. I mean, God forbids we play on the piano something for harpsichord. Naturally, for harpsichordists, it's a betrayal, so it's beyond interpretation. Stravinsky, Ravel considered their compositions of notation being so perfect that, rightfully so, that if interpretation occurred, it would be a betrayal. But that is wrong, because the universality of their own message is bigger than their opinion of it. That's why we keep liking the Chopin ballade, not because we love the way of the 19th century or we long the way of the 19th century in societal situations, but because in a way we idealize that romantic era that transported us away from the classicism and the Baroque, where the shape of the form in society formatted people to stifle their individual expression, their individual desire for independence from their country, from their society, from their religion, from their oppressing ideology that created those continents filled with empires. And of course, the power prevails, and then the influence of this power goes. All of Europe spoke Latin, now speaks English, tomorrow will speak Chinese. Okay, but within inside all these, we have the capacity to say, even if I can't read in the original text because it would take too long to learn all the languages, everything that I'm curious to understand that could bring me to understand better the world, I think that the translation is not per se a betrayal. I think, therefore, in music, an interpretation is not a betrayal. I think an interpretation is how you are given an opportunity to share with your fellow humans what it meant to you, to discover the humanity that comes through this piece of Schumann and this piece of Beethoven and this piece of Brahms and this piece of whoever you play. Not just notes, not typing, not just reciting precisely what a given edition pretending to be the original, because rarely there is one and sometimes none, only copies of copies. And anyway, musicologists don't agree between themselves, and it fills up pages and pages of doctorates, which is wonderful as long as it remains what it is, an additive to the thought process, food for thought. But at some point, performing is a life thing. It happens like when I speak to you like this, and when you speak to somebody else, you speak your thought, and it comes out spontaneously, thoughtfully, organized, or just in a thought, a suite of thoughts. Yeah, a thread of thoughts, I was going to say, but that's what I mean. And so therefore, I can say it like this, and I can say it like that, and I can say it like this. And who defines that the second theme is in a different tempo? The mezzo forte in Schubert is the same as in Beethoven, but perhaps not on this instrument or that. And how do I define the pulse? More so. How does an audience to whom I address my understanding of this music receive it? What is the amount of information that a receptive audience can perceive? How many people can perceive all the information that the text tells you through the performer? Perhaps not much. If you have perfect pitch, you hear the sounds naturally without to search for them. If you have relative pitch, you hear the intervals and you have a perfect hearing of the spaces in the air. So you realize that all these pitches represent leaps, and then you don't know which ones, but you sense the spaces. So you feel like you navigate in some kind of a three-dimensional space in which you know where you are in the piece. And then comes the rhythmicity, the pulse, the hinted pulse, the beat, which is supposed to unify, but also the lingering rhythmic patterns, the suspensions, the slurred notes, the ties that bind and everything. And so the music, of course, is not always a march, nor a waltz, nor a dance. Sometimes it is dancey, sometimes it's evocative of a dance, and even so not always fully in the steps of the dance choreographically, because it's stylized. Or sometimes it's just pure thoughts, like a fugue with voices over each other, under each other, and around each other, created by each other. And in fact, without a top and a bottom, an accompaniment and a melody, a theme and an arrange and something around it, is just pure thoughts that are flowing. And how many of them can you follow before you get lost in the thread? In other words, the listening is by itself a very big effort. If the performer plays voicing of inner voices, brings out things, highlighting things that you might have not seen have you read it yourself, could have you played it yourself. Not everybody can play everything they hear, because not everybody plays all the instruments, like not everybody talks all the languages. Well, I mean, some do more than most, but some cannot do all anyway. The point is that at some point, we relate to the interpretation as not only transmission, but a restatement with a conviction. Now, if the interpretation only the piece as it's written, and then I add a little bit ingredients, I like more salt, I like more this, I want my sauce to be a little bit more spicy, I think the rubato will add to it and make it more expressive, because if not, I won't be expressing enough what it means to me. In other words, the level of mirrored reflection by the performer of what the text suggests is the choice and the good taste of the performer. It should not be, and it should not be, and I insist, should not be, the definition by some third-party person who would define what is the good taste. It's their definition of good taste. There is no definition of good taste for all. It's only the adherence of an audience to the charisma of the performer at the moment of the performance that creates that sense of bond. That doesn't have to be explained, doesn't have to be drafted in texts, in paragraphs of musicological important definition. I think it should be just something that connects the thought process with the emotional element, and these two components vehicle the storytelling of the piece. Dramatic or happy, but how dramatic and how happy, and how sad within the happiness and how happy within the sadness, and how light and how deep and how everything is in your musical sculptor's hands, fingers, through imagination, hearing, and understanding, and then you translate it to the audience with what you consider. And sometimes you don't have to think about it as being the only way by yourself, because it evolves with you in life. You might consider at 20 that Spies, Schubert and Moderato, and then at 50 you think, this is too fast, I have to play it a bit slower because it lacks that sense that I really need in it to translate, like the gravitas, or the sense of pace, compared to only the harmonic change or the inharmonic modulation, because all these ingredients exist. They're not different elements that are just added in a sandwich. It's a whole. In fact, I find that we should always be incredibly driven by conviction and love therefore emotion and sentimentalism and drive when we want to choose a piece that we are translating to the audience, to our interpretation. And then accept that people will have different opinions and, of course, disagreements. You cannot expect everybody to agree, and that's not the point. Because if you think of that, then you cannot do any statement trying to be consensual. Then what's the lower denominator? Is just recite the notes. And that's unfortunately what becomes often with the competitions, where the lower denominator is the wrong note, the dictatorship of the wrong note. What about, I would like to be the dictatorship of the meaningful phrase, the dictatorship of the meant thought process that you describe through the psychological evolution of the piece, which captures and captivates an audience way more than any reviewer, any musicologist will ever do, other than to read their opinion about what they think is the structure, the tempo, the articulation, the style. Okay, fine, this is the ingredients which they have to define. Teachers do that in classrooms in order to explain the different styles. So yes, you study what you love to understand it, but when you perform it, you love it. And you love it because you perform it, and you perform it because you loved it in the first place. And you don't want to lose that on the way of all this knowledge, the acquired and the transmitted and the received, compared to the of course, I agree there should be doubts. You should accept a dissent. You should accept to say, well, okay, you think this is how it's meant to you, that's fine. Perhaps at some point I might bring to myself to it. But while I perform, I have my conviction and I project it. Another thought that I would like to share with you about this, there are many nuances in all these thoughts, is the interpretation only the flow of the piece itself, is written by the composer from the beginning to the end? And whatever happens in the moods, in changing moods, and artificially changing moods, or expressively overstated change of moods, or just subtly changed of moods, okay, it's part of the interpretational choices you do. Consciously or subconsciously, willingly or on the spot. Sometimes you deal with the unexpected on stage, the piano responds the way it does, the acoustic entices you to go to another tempo. It depends on how you perceive the atmosphere, because the audience being silent is holding their breath, and the held breath of an audience for 60, 70, 80 minutes is way more intense than the silence of the rehearsal with the empty room. Because you feel like there is an intensity of the silence, because these withheld breaths mean that they're trying to, well, of course they're breathing, but I meant to say they're withholding from making noise, expiring. And so they inspire and expire while you play, but you feel like they are there. For some people, stage fright is the threat of this silence. They think perhaps it's judgmental, which unfortunately very often is. But you don't want to think that. You don't want to try to seduce without love, as on stage you could try to do, just because it's more apparent to be the situation. You know, you're well dressed, it's a nice stage, the audience are well dressed too, it's a festive moment. Inevitably, we feel more heightened in our expressive moods than when we, I don't know, with our pajamas talk about death and life at midnight. It's a different level of intimacy. Perhaps it's an artificial intimacy, as art is, in a way, artificially life, or the different experiences of life. But I think that the point of my thought is, I think that yes, to a certain extent, while we do the performance of the piece, we do have a way to guide our audience through how we perceive the thought process of the piece. So are we commenting it while we're performing it, or are we supposed to just perform it and let the comment only happen post-scriptum, therefore directly with the audience or after the performance? In other words, to which level do we only stay in the craftsmanship of crafting the piece while we play it, and the artistry rather, if I say it correctly, which is to recreate the piece. I mean, who am I to be not humble enough to think I'm going to recreate the piece, which is already so beautifully created? I'm supposed to just appear and just recite it because it's bigger than me and I'm nothing and the piece is everything and the audience knows it. So why don't just show up with a score and just read it in front of the audience and everybody reads it and we don't need any performer. But we incarnate it. We bring to life the text. And therefore, it is our life with the text, not because we are bigger than the text, not because we are thinking that we are condescendent or arrogant, because humility is not to recite. Humility is to accept, to transmit your own personal experience with the piece. You're humbled in front of it, it's evident. But while you played, you're not at its level, but you appear like you are ping-ponging with Beethoven. You are conversing with Mozart. You're defining in a modulation with Schubert. And I think that that is the compelling part, to be alive and not to recite. And that's the compelling life for the audience, to see an artist driven and convinced and living in not beatitude, but in jubilant energy of the drive, the meaning of why they do what they do and why they brought you to listen to them. Not for them, but for the music they serve with the way it means to them. And I think that is more important than what it meant to some given musicologist who would write about it with their opinion, negative or positive, regardless. But the arguments are always about their defining their truth, when it's not the truth, it's their understanding. And it doesn't make it more universal because they broadcast it to others. I defend very much the fact that the composers, the performers, are not separated. Of course, today they are, compared to the education of the 19th century, where they all studied music and were all performers, composers, and transcribers, and improvisers. And in fact, basically they were musicians. All these were branches of the same. It's exactly what it was. And the specialization of the music thinkers, music makers, music organizers, music definers, music structurers, and then music publishers and music recorders. And so it creates this kind of levels of definition of what the music is supposed to be according to those who know versus those who do. And I think that those who do play can think as a composer, regardless if they compose. It doesn't mean that by changing the disposition of the diminuendo in a given score from one bar to another, if they think that's where it's supposed to lead better in their interpretation, that this is a betrayal to the score. It's way more subtle than the binary right or wrong, play what is written and nothing more. Yes, the text will be there after us, the text was here before us, but the text by itself doesn't speak, doesn't sing, doesn't move us. It's just a codification that, in fact, on paper, doesn't define that much into the detail, as the musicologists like to lock it in and then define who is right or not according to their reading of this Bible. The gospel of the musicologists. I refuse that. We don't start, we don't play, we don't study, we don't read, we don't love, we don't want to share, we don't tirelessly want to transmit music in order to convince somebody who knows about it and who writes about it. We are there to accept everybody who wants to hear what it means to us and share enthusiastically, emotionally, intensely what it does, and to do it with all the levels of our conviction and the sincerity of our engagement. That's what I think performers are, and they are in fact part composers and part transcribers and part improvisers. It doesn't matter which part. They respect enough the text to spend their life trying to play it best, even if it's not agreed by some people who write articles about it. I think playing is an ever-evolving, beautiful, emotional, ephemeral, unperishable perfume that remains in us lifelong experience as a listener, a performer. Ah, this melody. Ah, this interpretation. Ah, thank you to each and all of you.